I get asked quite often why our ship models are arranged the way they are. And today what we're going to do is talk about why they're arranged the way they are, which is to help represent what a fast carrier task force would look like and how they would operate in the ocean. My name is Elijah Otto, curator at the USS KIDD Veterans Museum. Today I'm going to break that down and explain why they are the way they are. A task force is a big military scientific term, which means a bunch of military assets put together for a specific purpose. So in our instance, we're recreating a carrier task force. Now, the task force itself went through a lot of changes in the interwar period and in the early war compared to late war. Early war task forces were usually around one fleet carrier. Task Force 17 is a really good example of this, which is centered around the USS Lexington. And it had a couple of escorting destroyers and cruisers and an oiler. As we get into the late war and through a bunch of hard-fought lessons, the later composition of a task force features multiple carriers and multiple other assets, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and a support arm with a bunch of auxiliaries, both for ammunition, oil, that sort of thing. So right here we have the carrier CVL-27. It's the USS Langley. We'll pretend it's a big Essex-class carrier for our purposes. This is the center of the task force, and its development actually proceeded all the way back into the 1920s. During the interwar period, which is about the 1920s through the mid-30s, the carrier was a brand new technology. No one really knew how to use them, along with the airplane as well. So what the U.S. Navy did was they put together something called the fleet problem. There were a bunch of these, and if y'all want a more detailed video about it, I can definitely do that. Just leave a little comment in the comment section. The carrier itself wasn't put into a task force during these times. It usually operated in a supporting role, usually scouting ahead with its aircraft, stuff like that. It wasn't until 1929 where a carrier task force that operated independently was seen as a feasible asset. 1929 fleet problem number 9, the USS Saratoga, it's a big Lexington-class aircraft carrier, and a singular escorting cruiser did a mock attack on the Panama Canal and was successful. So this kind of opened the eyes of naval thinkers, saying that the carrier can probably be the future, but we're not quite there just yet. So in the 1920s and 30s, like I said, there was a big debate between a carrier-centric task force and a battleship-centric task force. I'm going to do a quick little defense about the thinking that naval planners had compared to which one is which, or which one has more prevalence. Because in hindsight, we all know that the carrier won out, and at the end of the war, of course, carriers are going to be the dominant factor in the Pacific War. But a lot of people, naval thinkers, planners, they're familiar with battleships. They know what battleships can do. They're big, hardy vessels as compared to a new technology, which is the carrier itself. Now, the carrier usually operated in a lone task force, meaning by itself. Again, Task Force 17 is an example. Task Force 16 with the Yorktown is an example. No nation really put together all of their carrier air power into one specific formation. That wasn't done until the Imperial Japanese Navy did it with the KIDD Veterans, which incorporated its 4 big fleet carriers. The other arguments that happen compared to a battleship-centric task force versus a carrier-centric task force is that the battleship itself has not been sunk by aircraft at this point. And a couple of cases that I'm going to provide. First and foremost is going to be the Project B, which is Billy Mitchell's famous case that air power can sink battleships. To me, it's not the success that it was for 2 primary reasons. Number one, the battleship that they used to demonstrate this was a derelict Imperial German naval battleship, and it's a derelict, so it didn't move. It was already scheduled for scrap, and also didn't fire back. And the Billy Mitchell plan took all day, took numerous attempts and tries to sink the battleship via air power. Eventually, it did happen. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. It did happen. The battleship was sunk, but after a period of long extensions for this test, and again, the battleship itself is just a floating platform. 2 other examples of competing against this theory of naval air power versus battleship power is the British carrier raid at Taranto. They did a nighttime raid first off, so the battleships themselves, again, were not moving. They're stationary platforms. They didn't open fire until after they were attacked. And some damage was done, but again, no battleship was sunk. Okay, I'm going to use that term, important. Okay, it didn't sink. The other one is going to be the case against Bismarck. Everyone knows about the little biplane, little ferry swordfish sinking the battleship, but that's not the case. It was hit by a torpedo during the first carrier airstrike by the Ark Royal, and that did damage the ship, but it didn't sink it, and that damage was minimized via the torpedo blisters and stuff like that on the Bismarck. It wasn't sunk via naval air power. What happened was the British sent two battleships, the Rodney and the King George V, and two heavy cruisers, and they sunk it via naval gunpowder with the support of added torpedo strikes via British air power. So those are demonstrations that I can come up with that the carrier-centric thinking isn't just there yet. It doesn't happen until December 12th, 1941, where the Japanese proved that via air power alone, you can sink a battleship. And those two battleships were the Prince of Wales and then the really battle cruiser, the HMS Repulse. Those were sunk by naval air power, and that's what really opened the eyes of everybody in the room, saying, all right, naval air power is caught up. We have to think about putting carriers at the center of our task force compared to battleships. By 1943, the forces that were assigned to the Pacific area of operations under Nimitz underwent a really, really big reformation. And it was broken up into three main parts. The first part is going to be the Fast Carrier Task Force. And I do use the term fast for a reason, which we'll get into. So this has all of your big fleet carriers that are getting built, all of your light carriers and support vessels getting built. And it's going to be the main striking force of the Pacific Fleet. This is what's going to carry the fight over to Japan and cut across the Central Pacific or South Pacific with MacArthur's forces. The other secondary branch is going to be the amphibious forces. So this is going to be the fleet train that carries all the Marines and soldiers across the Pacific and all of their ammunition, supplies, food, all that sort of stuff that comes with moving a big amphibious force. The third one is going to be a redevelopment of its fleet train. So all of the auxiliaries that are getting pumped out, all of those fleet tankers, everything that takes to keep a fleet at sea for as long as possible is going to be in that third branch, including floating dry docks, which I do a video about if y'all are more interested in that. When I talked about the Fast Carrier Task Force, of course I used the word fast, and I do use that in a very meaningful way. Not every battleship got selected to be a part of the Fast Carrier Task Force. The whole point of being a Fast Carrier Task Force is to be fast. So only certain battleships got selected to go into the Fast Carrier Task Force, like the USS Alabama. She was able to keep up with the big Essex-class carriers. This way she can maneuver. The older battleships, kind of like the Pennsylvania, they were not designated as fast battleships, so they were stuck in primarily a bombardment role or surface fleet role. They were not assigned to battleships. Similarly, the New Mexico on the other side was one of these fast battleships, and we can see regarding the port side of our carrier. So this is going to be the center of our task force, which is going to be the center of our little formation here. What we have right here is the CVL-27, or the light carrier Langley. We'll keep her as she is, but pretend that there's going to be another one of these, and then two other big Essex-class carriers like the USS Lexington and Yorktown, both museum ships today. The carrier itself is going to be the main fighting arm of the fleet. So it has these aircraft here. So they're going to be in the center of this formation. You can think of like a big ring, or the little ring, the little apex right there in the center. These planes are going to be the main striking force of the fleet. So two big Essex-class carriers are going to be the striking force, and then these two light carriers are going to be sort of like its auxiliary. They're going to help maintain the combat air patrols, or CAPs, anti-submarine patrols. They also will maintain and work on airplanes and also deliver airplane and pilots to the big aircraft carriers, which are going to be used for scouting the enemy and attacking the enemy both at sea and on land. So we'll have 4 of those usually in a task force. You can look at Task Force 58.1 as the example right here. And so that's going to be the main center of our formation. On the outside of this ring, so as we go out, we're going to have our bigger ships. So our battleships and our big heavy cruisers, like the New Orleans, which is behind us. This right here is the USS Alabama. So we're going to put these about a couple thousand yards if we're under duress, or up to a couple miles out from the carrier. And the reason why we're still using them is for 2 vital roles. Number 1, you see all of these big heavy anti-aircraft batteries. The USS Alabama had 20 of these 5-inch guns, so really, really big, heavy anti-aircraft firepower. Of course, it also features your big guns. So in case we do need to have a surface engagement with the enemy, battleships will take care of that for us. Also, you could detach these battleships and these big heavy cruisers to do shore bombardments against land targets, softening up the target for amphibious forces. So the battleship still has its role, but it's lesser now and it's more of a protector. On the next outer ring is going to be our big cruisers. So like this one, for example, is going to be a light cruiser, the USS Memphis. Interwar period ship, but we'll pretend it's the big Baltimore class light cruiser, something like that. They function similarly like battleships. They have a really, really big anti-aircraft component to them. In fact, a whole class of cruiser was developed as anti-aircraft cruisers, the Atlanta class, and they're stationed on a further outside of the carrier formation. They still offer quite a punch with their 8-inch and 6-inch guns, so they can help with naval shore bombardments, or again, if a surface action is required, we can take care of it. Lastly, what we're going to talk about is our main role here at the USS KIDD. It's going to be the destroyer. This right here is a destroyer escort. We can pretend that she's a big destroyer, but she's going to have the same role. This is the Robert F. Keller. It provides anti-submarine warfare for the carrier task force. The airplanes can do a bunch of scouting. They can drop depth charges and help pinpoint. But destroyers are going to be your main effect for this. They feature sonar technology, of course, all of their depth charges and stuff like that. And they're really mobile, so they can pick something up on radar, a visual sighting of a periscope, something like that. They can go on over to that reported sighting pretty quickly and go ahead and go into action. The other thing they do, which when they're operating usually about 10 miles out from the carrier, is they're going to act as a physical screen, and the first physical screen to the aircraft carrier. So they have anti-aircraft armament. They also feature, especially in the late war, both air search radar and surface radar. So they can act as a very early screen against aircraft. So at Okinawa, the USS KIDD did exactly that. She acted as a screen for incoming aircraft, and she, of course, fought them with her anti-aircraft battery, but she also was on radio frequency with the CAPs, again, the combat air patrols that the aircraft carriers were flying, and helped direct them and pinpoint them to intercept the enemy formation. The other function that the destroyer did was, to me, a more vital one. It acted as what I would like to call a water taxi. So throughout the big carrier task force, again, we're featuring 4 to 6 carriers, several battleships, a bunch of cruisers, a bunch of destroyers. We need to do a whole bunch of auxiliary stuff to get that fleet maintained. One of them is going to be personnel change. So we're not going to waste a whole battleship moving in between the fleet, because number one, it's really big, and despite the miles and miles of this formation, ships have a tendency to run into each other. But destroyers are fast, they're mobile, and they're really, really nimble in these sort of environments. So they're going to go through and deliver personnel throughout the fleet. They'll also do other things like delivering mail throughout the fleet. So they'll go home, pick up the mail, go in through the fleet, distribute the mail. And a whole bunch of other stuff too, like library books, movies, stuff like that. The USS KIDD has this sort of reputation where she would do that service, but not for free. She did feature an ice cream machine. And so the Essex class carrier features about 3 ice cream machines. So whenever she pulled up alongside something like the Essex or Lexington, she would kind of hold ransom the mail from home, which of course people want to see. And so she would charge them ice cream for that service. The other thing that they did was that they provided what's called a plane guard. And so what happens during flight operations with the carrier is that one destroyer was assigned behind the carrier about 1,000 or so yards, and they did lifeguard duty, if you will. So the flight operation's happening. If a bad launch, takeoff, something like that's happening, or the landing of the plane doesn't go quite as smoothly as it should, and the pilot has to ditch, the aircrew has to go in, the destroyer that's behind them on this plane guard will go by and pick them up. So this way they have a sort of lifeline. And again, you don't want a battleship or a big cruiser to do that because, again, we're small and nimble. Battleships are big, slow-moving, stuff like that. Lastly, to round up everything, and again, this is why the models are the way they are, I'm going to talk about how this big task force moved. Like I said, it's a whole bunch of ships moving together. In the early war period, when the task forces were individual carriers, the strategy is to just scatter everybody. Because again, aircraft at this time is not proven to sink a ship. So if you're just one solitary ship, this way you have freedom of maneuver, aircraft doing dive bombs, torpedo runs, that sort of thing. Hopefully minimizes its chance to hit. But what they realize is as they scatter around and they become each individual ship, they're going to lose their concentration of firepower. So when I talked about the big anti-aircraft batteries of the battleships, what Task Force 58 realized is if we centered everybody around the carrier and just get everybody to move with the carrier, this way we can concentrate our firepower. So in combat or general readiness, carriers are going to be in the center of the task force, battleships are going to be on the outer edge, and then cruisers and your destroyers. They're all going to close in and concentrate their firepower. Then the carrier itself, whatever it needs to do, flight operations, of course, needs to go against the wind, so it's going to turn into the wind, and it'll throw up a couple signal flags, it'll do a radio communication or a TBS, talk between ships, and they're going to communicate, okay, we're going to go this direction, and then everybody together is going to perform that turn together. That's why you see on naval maps you have a bunch of aircraft carriers going in weird zigzags, big straight lines, zigzag, because they're always turning into the wind and then out of the wind. So that's how they would maneuver, and then that's again why our models are arranged the way they are. What if one of these big ships got hit by enemy forces or ran aground or ran into each other, something like that? Check out this YouTube video where I explain the floating dry dock process. And then if you like that, like and subscribe and follow us for some more content.